Friends, wow. Okay. Beautiful song. May the Lord remember us, and may we remember Him. Friends, I invite you, let's turn over to Exodus chapter 2 as we continue our series through Exodus, as we continue reading the story of God's wonderful liberation for all of us, how God intervenes on behalf of God's people, whether that's the thief on the cross, or whether that's the Israelites there in Egypt, or whether that's us here today. I invite you as we turn over to chapter 2. All right, starting in verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Hide him and have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning and remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land and into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You know, you read a passage all week and then you forget you've got to say Jebusites and Perizzites and all those things kind of sneak up on you as you get here. There's a guy named Andy Casagrande. Andy Casagrande is a cameraman for a series on TV. But he's the main cameraman for the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. Right? I think he's got some pretty good job security, if you ask me. Right? I don't think anybody's going to be wanting that job anytime soon. Low competition there. But he's the main cameraman. And once he was asked in an interview, he said, the interviewer asked, what in the world do you do when you see a great white shark swimming directly towards you? How are you supposed to respond to that? Well, his answer is pretty counterintuitive. He said to the interviewer, he said, what you do when you see that happening is that you swim directly toward the great white shark with your camera. He said, and the interviewer, of course, said, well, why in the world should you do that? I don't want to be lunch, right? And he said, for whatever reason, when you swim directly toward that great white shark, it activates some sort of defense mechanism. Everything in the ocean generally swims away from the shark. He said, but when you swim towards it, it sets off something and makes it hesitate. Wait a minute. It's not swimming away from me. And Casagrande said in the interview, he said, if you don't act like prey, they won't treat you like prey. You know, there's some things in life that are frightening and scary. And I think everything in us, when we encounter those things, wants us to run away, wants us to get as far away from there as possible. But maybe the way forward isn't to run away from those things. Maybe it's that we actually have to move towards those things and face them head on. I was thinking a lot about that this week as I was reading through, once again, this story in Exodus. And as we kind of walk through the text here in a minute, I first want us to go back to what we talked about a little bit last week. Before we get to 11, I want us to just go back and remember a few of those details about Moses and his origin story. If you remember from the first couple verses of Exodus chapter 2, we read that Moses' mom, we're told a little bit about her, right? We know the story about how she had Moses and put him in the ark, the little basket that went down the river and was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And then again, she got to raise Moses for a little while before Moses went into the Pharaoh's daughter's home and lived there. But if you may or may not have noticed last week, we noticed that Moses' dad is strangely absent from the text. Right? There's no mention anywhere of Moses' dad. We don't know anything about him. What happened to him? Was he worked to death as a slave, literally worked to death perhaps? Was he separated from his family in the midst of being in Egypt, or maybe in the stress of everything that's going on in the Israelite slaves' lives? Maybe things just didn't work out with Moses' mom and he. But his dad is no longer there in the picture. All we do know is that Moses, it seems that Moses we weren't told much about him. And maybe that means that Moses, in fact, never even knew who his father was. And as we think about that, we should also notice Moses' name. Because in Hebrew, Moses' name sounds similar to the word for draw out, as in Pharaoh's daughter was saying that she drew him out of the water, kind of memorializing for all time that she's the one that rescued him, right? She's the one that drew him out of the water. Which is interesting, but in Egyptian, Moses' name actually sounds like the word that just means son of. And typically, you would say that word plus the family name. So you'd be son of Ramses or son of whoever. But But here she just names him Moses, which just leaves his name saying Moses is son of ... It's another way of saying when we look at Moses' life, there's some big questions about who Moses is that are just strangely absent from the story. Moses' very name is almost like a question to us. Who really is Moses? Who is he the son of? Whose family does he belong to? It's this question about who is Moses that I think forms maybe the central question for his life. And I think often we ask ourselves too that same question, who are we? Who are we? We see this more in Moses' early life as we go into our teaching text from today. We see, and as we go into this scene in verses 11 through 15, I want us to use our imaginations for a little bit as we imagine what Moses' life was like up until this point. We can imagine that when Moses was a young Hebrew child, we can picture him with his mom as he was getting nursed. Maybe as she was nursing him, she was singing songs to him, and she was looking down, staring at him as they built that bond that only mothers and babies do. When they look up and smile at each other, and all those hormones and chemicals form that bond that only happens between mother and child. We can imagine the heartache that existed when Moses was then taken from his mom once again and moved into that Egyptian home. But not just any home, a home of great privilege as the daughter of Pharaoh. What was this like for Moses? Did Moses perhaps look different from his adopted household as a Hebrew? How much did he remember of his origins? Did Pharaoh's daughter ever tell him the story of his birth and what happened to him? Were any of the Hebrew slaves there in the palace? Did he get to talk to them at all? What was it like for Moses to live as an ethnically different yet privileged child growing up in this kind of divided world that he was in? Where did his identity lie? The narrator seems to tell us that the narrator wants us to know that Moses was Hebrew. As he says there in verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk, one of his own people. It made me wonder as I read that this week, had Moses ever walked out there before? Or had he stood on the palace that he grew up in and looked out and saw the people there, his own people, as he watched them work? Did he ever wonder as he looked out and saw someone carrying bricks, is that my dad? Or as he saw a woman there working her hands raw, did he ever wonder, is that my mom? As he looked out there and saw those people and their pain, did he ever wonder, this is a pain that I hear about, but it's definitely not something that I ever know about in my day-to-day life? I wonder if Moses ever looked at himself and his safety and his comfort and his life of ease and ever wondered, do I belong out there or do I belong in here? Until that day that he musters up the courage to actually go out into the fields and walk among his own people, to maybe try to get a taste of what life is like as a Hebrew working in an Egyptian world. And that's where he sees it. He sees this famous instance that we read about in Scripture, this Egyptian striking a Hebrew. And something just kind of goes off in him. Something is just triggered within him. This sense of justice or righteous anger or whatever it is wells up within him. And he thinks to himself, maybe I need to use my privilege finally to do something about this. But we're left wondering, who's he going to side with? His birth family, his family of origin, or maybe the family that he grew up with? Who are his people? Who is Moses? And when he does finally make that choice and strikes out and kills the Egyptian and hides the body in the sand, I wonder what his thoughts were like as he goes back into the home and then the next day comes out again. Why did he want to come back out? Was it to make sure that his tracks were covered? Was he feeling a sense of pride at saving the defenseless? Maybe he was out of a sense of guilt, that killing weighing on him for whatever reason. That's when he sees the two slaves fighting, and he's confused. Wait a minute, you're both Hebrews. What are you guys doing fighting each other? They aren't the enemy, the Egyptians are. But the Hebrews look at him, and what do they see? They see someone who in some ways looks like them. He has Hebrew features. Maybe he speaks Hebrew with a little Egyptian twang to it. But they also see a young man whose hands aren't very calloused because he's never had to work like they have. Whose back maybe has never felt that lash of a whip on it. Whose clothes and whose appearance speaks of them, but also not of them at the same time. That Moses is like them, like a Hebrew, but not quite. And he's like an Egyptian, except maybe not quite either. And they see this guy calling them out, and they say to him, "Who do you think you are to be a judge and a ruler over us? Who do you mean you are to tell us? Are you going to kill us as you killed the Egyptian?" Almost as if to say, you thought that you were serving justice, but maybe you were actually just serving your own sense of guilt and shame, that while we have been out here all day, for our whole lives, you have sat up there and watched us from the palace. And when you killed that Egyptian, you could go back to your palace of luxury, but us, we're left out here dealing with the consequences of who's going to pay for this. Maybe what they're really asking Moses is, who do you think you are, Moses? So as Moses goes back to his adopted home, feeling that sting of rejection, as he goes back to the people that raised him, I wonder what he thought as he walked back in the home that day. Did he hear his mom say, "Hey, did y'all hear the news? That a couple of Israelites went out and struck and killed one of our Egyptian brothers?" What did Moses feel in that moment? And what will Pharaoh say when he finds out? Well, we know what Pharaoh will say. All the while, Moses once again is wondering, who am I? I wonder if we can name or draw out what Moses is feeling through his whole life as he has struggled with his identity. Sure, as he flees to Midian, we can talk about how he definitely felt a sense of self-preservation kicking in. But if I had to guess, I would name what Moses is experiencing in those moments as something that I think many of us are all too familiar with. The experience of shame. Of shame. What is shame? Shame goes beyond telling us that we've done things wrong in our life to telling us that it's not just that what we've done is wrong, but that there's something about us that's wrong. There's something about us that just isn't right, that we're not good enough, that we're not smart enough, that we're not pretty enough, that we're not creative enough, that we're not whatever enough. Shame is that painful experience that something you have done or failed to do has made you feel unwanted or unworthy of love and belonging. Shame is that feeling that we are somehow fundamentally flawed, that we don't belong one place or the other, as Moses. Shame is the thing that tells us that we've screwed up too bad, past the point of no return. Or that when we are treated poorly, when someone treats us badly, that we're just getting what we deserve. Shame lives in our experiences. It lives, and its origin can come from the trauma or abuse that maybe we experienced, especially as kids, that cause us to no longer feel safe or to feel loved or to feel seen or heard. And sometimes shame doesn't come in from one of those experiences. Sometimes shame just sort of creeps into our life as we experience a long line of failure or disappointment or hurt. In other words, what I call just growing up as an adult, right? That's been my experience in so many ways. A long line of failure, disappointment, and hurt in many cases. Shame's power, that feeling that we have within us, its power exists in the ability to scare us into silence. That if others really knew all of us, our entire self, that they wouldn't love us or wouldn't want to even be with us, that they would leave us if they saw what our life is really like, or they knew every intimate part of who we are. And that the only way to be safe, the only way to be okay is to hide all the ugly parts of our life from anyone else, just like we're Adam and Eve in the garden, putting fig leaves over us. Shame whispers to us to be vulnerable with yourself is death. But the real danger of shame is that it becomes the storyteller of our lives. It becomes the author of our lives. It tells us what God thinks about us. That God's grace is for us, is for everybody but us. That God's love for us is really just God tolerating us because He's God and has to. And that if we work hard enough, if we're a good enough person, if we do enough for the church or for God, then only then will God be happy with us and give us the care that we are so longing for. That's what shame whispers to us. Shame makes us wonder, well, who am I? And who is God? And shame is just like that great white predator to our souls. Shame is what Moses was running away from. And just like Moses, I think we tend to want to run from our shame too. We want to leave our home and go as far away as we can. We want to lock away those painful memories and try to lose the key. We publicly will live one way, and then privately we'll try to medicate our pain however we can through different behaviors or substances, whatever will make us feel better for the moment. And we think we can outgrow it or move past it, or we can just deal with it on our own. But just like Moses, as we see here, we may get older, but shame doesn't just go away. It's something we carry with us, just like I imagine Moses felt when he met his future father-in-law and said to him, go get that Egyptian. Because we all know when someone says that right word, or we have that right thing that is said, or that right experience, and that pain that we hold within us comes right back to the surface. Right back to the surface. Just like Moses, we can still hear the pain of his wound as he even names his child, a word that sounds similar to foreigner. And I'm sure when his wife asked, well, what is that about? And when he says, I have been a foreigner living in a foreign land, is he talking about Midian or Egypt? Is he talking about the palace or the slave fields? Is he talking about the songs that maybe his biological mom sung over him as a baby, or learning Egyptian with his adopted mom? Or is he talking about his own heart? Shame is the thing that makes us wonder who we are. And the more we try to swim away from it, the more power it has over our lives. Until that is, God finds Moses and God finds us. We have there that beautiful, amazing story of God in the burning bush, where Moses is out as a shepherd years later, years past those moments, and he's up on that mountain, Mount Horeb, and he sees that bush that just draws his attention. He gets curious about it and goes over to it, and as he goes over there, God says to him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, which I think is so interesting because I don't know if Moses has any idea who his father really is. And yet God speaks to him in that way. Whereas Moses doesn't know his identity, God tells Moses, you belong to a story and a people. You belong to a family. God immediately tells Moses and speaks to Moses in that place of shame that he has, in that place of his most wounded identity. No, you belong to me and to my story. God speaks into those places of shame and tells us that God is the storyteller of our lives, not shame. You all might remember I guess it's been a few years now, that famous incident, and I forget which award ceremony it was, the famous slap incident with Will Smith, right? Y'all remember that from whenever that was? Well, it was interesting if you read any part of Will Smith's biography, he talks about a certain time in his life. And he wrote this in his autobiography. He says, when I was 9 years old, I watched my father punch my mother in the side of the head so hard that she collapsed. That in that moment in the bedroom, when I saw that, probably more than any other moment in my life, that has defined who I am. He goes on to write, within everything I have done since that moment, the awards and accolades, the spotlights and the attention, the characters and the laughs, there has been a subtle string of apologies to my mother for my inaction that day, for failing her in that moment, for failing to stand up to my father, for being a coward. Can you understand why maybe he responded the way he did when his wife was insulted? Can you understand how the shame from that one moment that seared in his mind from when he was a child, still speaks to him and still is the storyteller of his life? And how I wonder if God were to meet him in those moments, if he were to go back and see him in those moments and see that God would say to him, you are only a child. And that maybe that moment in the bedroom that day was less about you let's go even further, was nothing about you and was everything about your dad and what was going on in his life. And that you as a child were never designed to be the defender like that. What would it be like if God were to meet us in whatever moment we have that is our deepest, darkest moment of shame? The moment that we keep replaying in our heads again and again. That thing that drives us even when we aren't even sure what that is. See, God does that here with Moses, and I think God does that here, wants to do that here with all of us. Because whatever it is that we are running from, whatever it is that we feel most ashamed about, whatever it is that we define ourselves by, if it's like Will Smith, like a coward, or whatever it might be, God says to us here that that is not the most important thing about you. And that in those moments that you feel the most cringe in your heart and soul, that God wants to speak to you there and say that you are His beloved child. That you bring Him great joy, and that you're defined not by those moments, not by shame, but you're defined by His story and who He declares you to be. I mean, what sense does it make for God to say, you know what, I want to heal the Israelite people, so you know what I'm going to do to rescue this entire people group? I'm going to go all the way over here to another country, and I'm going to find one cowardly man who ran away from his problems, and I'm going to find him, and I'm going to heal this guy, and I'm going to send him back to go rescue the people. What if the way that God heals us is then the way God heals everybody? What if God thinks that we're important enough to speak to and to heal, and it's through our healing of our shame that God might do a mighty work through us? Friends, I pray that as we consider this story, as we consider the life of Moses, and we consider our own story, that we might discover the God who speaks to us and says, I am who I am. I am who I've always been. And I'll be with you wherever you go. That you don't have to hide your face from looking at me. You don't have to turn away from me when someone speaks and it gets to that tender place in your heart, because I'm going to be there with you. And whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever it is that you're afraid to look at, that I'm going to heal it because I am God. So friends, I just want to invite you, as we kind of close up shop here, the way forward to deal with our shame is not to run from it. It's not to hide from it, but it's to face it head on. And that is always a painful experience. But if we're willing to go through that pain, if we're willing to go to that place and to reveal and to be vulnerable with each other and with God, I guarantee that God will do a mighty, incredible healing work in your life, and that God will use that healing to do so much more good for others. May we remember that. And may we remember that we have people here at this church that want to be that safe person for you. So may we remember the God who heals us from all our shame. Let's pray.